into by a web of lies, potential foul play, and a corporate cover-up that only deepens the tragedy of a young man's life cut short on what should have been the happiest of occasions. Welcome. This is Crime Uncovered, where every case has a story, and the truth is often stranger and darker than fiction. If you are yet to subscribe to my channel, kindly do so to stay updated on the latest crime we would uncover next. George Smith IV and his wife Jennifer Hagel were at the start of what seemed to be a fairy tale life. They were the embodiment of young love, bright, successful, and full of promise. George, a smart and driven young man from Connecticut, had recently graduated from Babson College, a prestigious business school, and had already found his place in the family liquor business, Costco Liquors. The family business had been thriving for decades, and George was poised to take over and continue his father's legacy. The hard work, dedication, and values instilled in him by his family would set the foundation for a successful future. Jennifer, on the other hand, had recently earned her master's degree in education. She was preparing to embark on her career as an elementary school teacher, a job she had always dreamed of. Her future was bright, filled with the promise of impacting young lives in her community. The couple's relationship was a love story that seemed destined to last. After meeting several years earlier, George and Jennifer reconnected, and the chemistry between them was undeniable. It didn't take long for George to realize that Jennifer was the one he wanted to spend the rest of his life with. Together, they made the decision to get married, and their wedding was a beautiful celebration of their love. 11 days after their fairy tale wedding, the couple embarked on their honeymoon aboard the Brilliance of the Seas, a luxurious Royal Caribbean cruise ship, Feet. Their honeymoon was meant to be a joyous occasion, a time to celebrate their love and begin the next chapter of their lives as husband and wife. However, their dream honeymoon would soon turn into something unimaginable. What began as a celebration of love and new beginnings quickly morphed into a chilling mystery. Just 10 days into their marriage, George Smith would vanish from the cruise ship, leaving behind not only his wife and family, but also the world searching for answers. What should have been the start of a beautiful life together ended in a tragic and unsolved disappearance, leaving Jennifer, the Smith family, and countless others with more questions than they could ever have imagined. The morning of July 5, 2005, began like any other day for the passengers of Brilliance of the Seas. The sun rising over the horizon, the ship docked at its scheduled stop, the promise of new adventures in the Mediterranean. But for Jennifer Hagel Smith, that morning would be anything but ordinary. As she awoke, the peaceful morning quickly gave way to a haunting reality. Her husband, George Smith IV, was missing. Jennifer's heart must have raced as she realized the absence of her new husband, the man she had just married less than 2 weeks earlier. She hadn't seen him since the night before, around 2:30 a.m., when they had been in the casino together. They had been drinking and laughing, enjoying their honeymoon to the fullest, but now George was nowhere to be found. Jennifer must have felt the crushing weight of confusion and fear as she searched the cabin for him, calling his name, hoping for some sign, some clue as to where he could be. But there was nothing. He was gone. Her panic must have set in as she reported George's disappearance to the ship's crew. Within moments, a search of the ship began, with staff scrambling to comb through every corridor, every cabin, and every public space. But as hours ticked by, the sense of dread only deepened. This was no ordinary missing persons case. Something much darker was at play. Then the horrifying discovery was made. Bloodstains were found on the awning below George and Jennifer's cabin on Deck 7. At first, the crew dismissed the sight as a minor mishap, perhaps a small accident, a spill, or an unfortunate injury. But as investigators arrived and began their search, the full scope of the situation began to unfold, and the story that emerged was chilling. The cabin itself was a scene of chaos. The bed was askew, the furniture was overturned, signs of a violent struggle. The bloodstains found on the sheets matched George's, and it was clear that whatever had happened inside that cabin was far more than a simple accident or mishap. The evidence pointed to something far more sinister, a confrontation, a fight, a desperate struggle. But the most haunting discovery was made on the balcony. There, investigators found what would become a crucial piece of the puzzle: a strange hip impression on the railing. The mark suggested that someone had been perched on the edge, perhaps for a brief moment. And from the position of the imprint, it was likely George. Had he been standing near the railing, perched dangerously close to the edge, before falling into the deep, unforgiving waters of the Mediterranean Sea? As the search continued, the captain was alerted to the possibility that George had fallen overboard. But the discovery raised far more questions than answers. How did this happen? Why had George disappeared so mysteriously? And why was there no clear explanation for his absence? His body was nowhere to be found. Not in the water, not on the ship, nowhere. The vastness of the Mediterranean seemed to have swallowed him whole, leaving only a trail of confusion and pain. The Smith family's worst fears began to take shape. The deeper the investigation went, the clearer it became. George wasn't just missing. Something terrible had happened to him. The family, still reeling from the shock of their son's sudden disappearance, was left in a state of anguish, forced to confront the painful reality that the answers they desperately sought might never come. The ocean, as deep and mysterious as the case itself, held no answers. All they had were questions, and the growing horror that their son might never be found. Royal Caribbean's response to George Smith Ford's disappearance was nothing short of baffling, and ultimately, it would raise serious questions about the company's commitment to transparency, safety, and accountability. Instead of providing the Smith and Hagel families with the crucial details surrounding the events of that night, the cruise line went to great lengths to keep a tight lid on the information. What should have been a cooperative effort to find the truth quickly became a frustrating ordeal filled with evasion and silence. The initial signs that something terrible had happened were there from the start. The blood on the ship's awning below the couple's cabin, the chaotic mess inside the cabin, and the disturbing reports from passengers who had heard noises, shouting, furniture being thrown, and a loud thud, all pointed to a violent struggle. Yet, Royal Caribbean chose to withhold these critical details from both the families and the public. The fact that these pieces of evidence were ignored or kept hidden only added to the growing sense that something was amiss. Jennifer Hagel was eventually allowed to contact her family back in Connecticut, but even then, she was not fully informed about what had transpired in her own cabin. She was never told the extent of the destruction, the bloodstains, or the strange impressions left on the balcony railing. The truth about the broken door and the sounds of a violent altercation that had been heard by passengers on neighboring decks was kept under wraps. Instead of working with law enforcement and the families to uncover the truth, Royal Caribbean appeared to be more focused on minimizing damage to its reputation and avoiding a public relations nightmare. This lack of transparency was alarming, especially considering the suspicious circumstances surrounding George's disappearance. It was clear that George's night out with Jennifer and their new friends, including 20-year-old Josh Asson, had played a significant role in the tragic events that followed. The couple and their group had spent the evening in the ship's casino, drinking heavily and losing money at poker. The night continued with drinks at the ship's disco, where the party extended into the early morning hours. But there was more to the story than simply a night of heavy drinking. It would later come to light that the group had been drinking alcohol in excess, including absinthe, a strong liquor that had been smuggled onto the ship. The dangerous combination of intoxication and poor judgment set the stage for a tragic turn of events. As more information emerged, witnesses began coming forward with disturbing details that would raise further suspicion about what happened inside the cabin. Passengers reported hearing loud noises from the Smiths' room, sounds of shouting, objects crashing against the walls, and what seemed to be an argument escalating out of control. One neighbor in the adjacent cabin described hearing a loud thud around 4 a.m., followed by the sound of footsteps and men leaving the area. Another troubling detail was that a security guard, who had been called to investigate the noise, arrived to find teens leaving the area, but no one could explain what had happened inside the room, and the details about the events that had unfolded remained obscured. Despite the mounting evidence, when the Smith family repeatedly asked Royal Caribbean if the ship had been thoroughly searched, they were met with vague answers and outright refusals. They were told the ship had been searched, but no one mentioned the crucial bloodstains on the ship's awning or the disturbing sounds of violence heard by multiple witnesses. When the family pressed the cruise line for further information, the silence became deafening. They were led to believe the investigation was proceeding smoothly, but no one was sharing the key details that might have helped bring clarity to the situation. This lack of transparency and reluctance to share critical information only deepened suspicions. It seemed as though Royal Caribbean was actively covering up what had happened, just as they had done with another suspicious incident months earlier. In 2004, a crew member had gone overboard from the same ship, Brilliance of the Seas, under similar mysterious circumstances. That case, too, had been swept under the rug, with little to no media attention and no clear answers provided to the family. The cruise line's pattern was becoming all too clear: silence, cover-up, and hope that the incident would eventually fade from public memory. In both cases, the cruise line's primary concern seemed to be protecting its public image, rather than uncovering the truth or providing justice to the affected families. Royal Caribbean's handling of the situation stood in stark contrast to the expectations that families and passengers would have of a company responsible for the safety and well-being of its guests. Instead of offering help and clarity, the cruise line's refusal to disclose critical details only added to the mounting grief and confusion. For the Smith and Hagel families, each unanswered question, each delay in the investigation, only intensified the pain of not knowing what happened to George. In the midst of the tragedy, the cruise line's refusal to provide transparency would fuel public suspicion and outrage. The families and the public were left to wonder, what was Royal Caribbean hiding, and why were they so unwilling to share the full scope of what had happened on that fateful night? This sense of distrust, coupled with the unanswered questions about George's disappearance, would continue to haunt the Smith family, and the tragic disappearance of George Smith IV would remain a dark, unresolved chapter in the cruise line's history. As the investigation into George Smith IV's disappearance continued, the evidence began to paint a troubling picture that suggested George's death was not an unfortunate accident, as initially believed. Rather, the evidence hinted strongly at foul play, raising more questions than answers and casting a shadow over the entire situation. Jennifer Hagel Smith, who had been George's new wife, quickly became a central figure in the investigation. Her actions, particularly in the hours after George's disappearance, seemed increasingly suspicious to investigators. Instead of searching frantically for her missing husband, Jennifer had opted to go to the spa. To many, this seemed a bizarre choice, given the gravity of the situation. While George was nowhere to be found, Jennifer appeared more concerned with recovering from a hangover than with finding her husband. This puzzling behavior didn't sit right with the police, who had hoped to see a more desperate, frantic reaction from a wife whose husband had vanished. The ship's crew had already found signs of a violent struggle in the cabin, and the police began to wonder, could she be hiding something? Further scrutiny was placed on Jennifer's movements during the night, particularly through security footage captured on the ship. Around 3:30 a.m., Jennifer was seen leaving the disco alone, visibly intoxicated and unsteady on her feet. The footage showed her stumbling out of the club, leaving behind her husband, who had remained with a group of men. One of these men, Lloyd, a casino manager, had been seen spending time with Jennifer earlier that night. Their interactions were more than just friendly, and as the investigation deepened, it came to light that Jennifer had been romantically involved with Lloyd prior to her marriage to George. This revelation only added to the mystery and raised more questions about the true nature of their relationship and what had transpired after the night of drinking and partying. Jennifer's connection with Lloyd, paired with her odd behavior the following morning, deepened suspicions. Was there a more personal motive behind George's disappearance? Something that involved the tangled relationships between the newlyweds and their fellow passengers? But Jennifer was not the only person under investigation. The attention soon turned to the three young men who had been with George in the casino and the disco that night: Zach, Greg, and Rusty. These men had been drinking heavily with George, and it was revealed that they had sneaked alcohol onto the ship, defying the cruise line's rules. The trio's behavior throughout the night had been erratic, and their excessive drinking only added to the chaos. Witnesses later testified to seeing the group getting louder and more disruptive as the night wore on. But when the police attempted to question the three men, they invoked their Fifth Amendment rights, refusing to testify or cooperate with the investigation. The refusal to cooperate raised red flags. What were they hiding? What had happened that night in the cabin? And why were they so unwilling to talk? The investigation into the trio's involvement in George's disappearance took a darker turn years later. In 2019, Greg was found dead in his car, shot multiple times in what appeared to be a targeted attack. The timing of Greg's death was suspiciously close to a statement he had made just before his death, claiming that the truth about George's disappearance would soon be revealed. His murder only added another chilling layer to the already complex and unsettling case. The connection between Greg's death and the events surrounding George's disappearance remained unclear, but the coincidence was too striking to ignore. The investigation into George Smith IV disappearance became a web of lies, inconsistencies, and unanswered questions. What had really happened that night? Was George's death truly an accident, or was there something more sinister at play? The investigation into the actions of Jennifer, the three young men, and the strange circumstances surrounding the entire case only deepened the mystery, leaving everyone involved with more questions than answers. The Smith family, utterly devastated by the sudden loss of their son, found themselves trapped in a nightmare of uncertainty and unresolved grief. What should have been a time of joy, celebration, and love had been replaced by the agonizing silence of unanswered questions. Each day without answers left them feeling as though they were trapped in a limbo, unable to move on or find peace. Desperate for clarity, the family sought out forensic experts to investigate the cabin and re-examine the evidence with fresh eyes. One of these experts was Dr. Henry Lee, a renowned forensic scientist who had worked on several high-profile cases. Dr. Lee's investigation into the balcony where George had allegedly fallen was thorough, and his conclusion was both chilling and unsettling. After carefully reviewing the scene, he determined that George's fall could not have been a mere accident. The angle, the positioning of the hip impression on the balcony railing, and the violent nature of the scene all suggested something far more sinister. Dr. Lee believed that George had likely been pushed from the railing rather than having fallen on his own, but without concrete evidence, a body, eyewitnesses, or a confession, his conclusions remained speculative. The lack of physical evidence meant that the case remained frustratingly open-ended, leaving the Smith family clinging to the hope that one day, the truth would finally come to light. As years passed, the investigation, once a focal point of law enforcement efforts, began to fade into the background. The FBI, after years of investigation, closed the case in 2015, officially ruling George's death an accident. The absence of a body, combined with a trail of inconsistencies, lies, and half-truths, made it impossible to prove foul play beyond a reasonable doubt. The ruling felt like a punch to the gut for the Smith family, a decision that closed the door on their search for justice without providing any of the closure they so desperately needed. It was a crushing blow to the family, leaving them to wonder if they would ever know the full story of what happened to their son. With the case closed, Jennifer Hagel Smith, George's wife, moved on with her life. She remarried and became involved in charity work, trying to build a new life despite the haunting memories of that fateful night. Though Jennifer passed polygraph tests, her behavior that night, her calmness, her lack of urgency to search for her missing husband, remained a dark cloud that followed her. The suspicion that had surrounded her actions during the investigation never fully dissipated, and the weight of that shadow seemed to follow her wherever she went. The mystery of George Smith IV remains one of the most perplexing and tragic cases in recent true crime history. The lack of closure, the silence from Royal Caribbean, and the numerous unanswered questions leave a permanent scar on everyone involved. For the Smith family, the pain of not knowing what truly happened to their son continues to linger. Each passing year only solidifies the painful reality that they may never get the answers they so desperately sought. The uncertainty, the lack of a final resolution, means that the Smith family is left not only grieving their son's death, but also mourning the loss of the truth that should have been theirs to know. As the years go by, the case of George Smith IV remains unsolved, and the truth of what happened that night on the Brilliance of the seas seems increasingly elusive. Despite the best efforts of investigators, the Smith family, and the public, the full story of George's disappearance may never be known. Whether it was an accident, a murder, or something more sinister, the death of George Smith IV will continue to haunt those involved, leaving them with a chilling question. What really happened that night on the cruise ship? If you found this case as chilling and mysterious as we did, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more true crime stories. Don't miss out on future cases, updates, and deep dives into true crimes.